President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, there is a job opening at the Interior Department, and that can mean only one thing. Another Trump nominee who incredibly is already under investigation for misconduct even before his first day on the job. This time it's Daniel Giorgiani, a long-serving Trump interior official who's up for a powerful role as the department's Solicitor General. Mr. President and colleagues, I have put a public hold on this nominee, and if anything, the case for withholding action on this nominee has gotten greater in the last few days. Just in the last few days, the department's Inspector General has made it clear that this is an individual that he is going to investigate. And I will tell my colleagues that if you're putting somebody already under investigation on a fast track to the Interior Department Corruption Hall of Fame, right up there with Ryan Zinke, that is a mistake I believe the Senate is going to regret. It probably doesn't take an Inspector General investigation to uncover why this is a mistake, and I'm going to explain this here this morning briefly. First, I believe it's important to start with an honest assessment of what Donald Trump's appointees have done at the Interior Department. Under this president, it is often difficult for one agency's corruption to stand out above the rest. But somehow Interior Department officials manage to do that again and again. Mr. Giorgiani, a former industries advisor for Koch Industries, is an example of just this type of behavior. The Office of the Interior Solicitor General is in charge of legal issues and ethics for the department. A big team, Mr. President, lots of power. Mr. Giorgiani has been a key member of the Solicitor General's office. Now, his own words indicate that he doesn't believe that his primary function at Interior is to protect public lands and uphold an ethical standard. We already heard discussion earlier this morning that he wrote to agency colleagues that, and we've been quoting it, he said, "Our job is to protect the Secretary." Those are his words, not the words of anybody here in the Senate. What senators may not know is Mr. Giorgiani was talking about Ryan Zinke, who brought on a Category 5 ethical hurricane during his brief time as Interior Secretary. In the same email, Mr. Giorgiani boasted about having impeded Inspector General investigations into the misuse of taxpayer funds for travel. It wasn't just talk. The record shows that covering up dirty ethics and potential law-breaking is routine for Mr. Giorgiani. By my count, as of now, there are at least 4 investigations into wrongdoing at the Interior Department that were closed or found inconclusive due to a lack of cooperation or records production on Mr. Giorgiani's watch. These investigations covered a multitude of issues, from the potential misuse of expensive chartered travel to a halted study on the crucial health impacts of potentially dangerous Interior Department energy policies. Then there's the issue of the Interior Department's new policy under the Trump administration with respect to the Freedom of Information Act. The new policy, and again, this is a retreat from public interest standards, this policy gives political appointees unprecedented control over the department's response to Freedom of Information Act requests. In my view, it looks like an effort to conceal the fact that Trump interior officials are spending their days doing the bidding of a host of special interests. There is clear evidence that this new, secretive Freedom of Information Act policy was implemented under the Trump administration, that Mr. Giorgiani knew about it, and that he was up to his eyeballs in putting this in motion. When I asked Mr. Giorgiani about the Freedom of Information Act policy during an Energy and Natural Resources hearing, Mr. Giorgiani actually claimed it didn't exist. He later told one of our colleagues, the distinguished senator from Maine, Senator King, he had no involvement in Freedom of Information Act responses. I want it understood, Mr. President, that I believe Mr. Giorgiani lied to the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and perjured himself to that body. Colleagues, I know that members on both sides are concerned about what has happened with the Freedom of Information Act under this administration. I want to commend the several Republican senators who have said they're troubled about what this administration is doing with the Freedom of Information Act, so-called awareness reviews by appointees that really aren't hard to figure out. It's about secretive political interference. What you are seeing with the Freedom of Information Act is inconsistent with the intent of Congress, and it is wrong. The importance of government openness and honesty with the American people ought to be a bipartisan proposition. It's in everybody's interest, Democrat and Republican, to protect the Freedom of Information Act from evasion and protect it from abuse. That's part of why this new interior policy on the Freedom of Information Act is so troubling. As I mentioned, on Friday, the Interior Inspector General confirmed to me that Mr. Giorgiani is currently under investigation for his role in this Freedom of Information Act policy. So, Mr. President and colleagues who may be following this, let's just understand what's going on. We're getting ready to vote on whether to advance somebody who's under a formal Inspector General investigation. The fact the Inspector General is investigating such a serious matter ought to be enough all by itself to stop this nomination from going forward. Certainly Mr. Giorgiani's own words about how he views the job, not about protecting the public, but about protecting someone like Ryan Zinke, that ought to be disqualifying. If Mr. Giorgiani is confirmed the person who will be in charge of ethics at the Interior Department told colleagues his job was to protect a crook. That's what he said. Colleagues, this administration, in too many instances, has made deceit and unethical conduct the norm at the Interior Department. Trump officials have sidelined the department's core purpose, which is to protect our treasured public lands on behalf of all Americans. Too often, it seems that they side with special interests that will pollute America's air, poison the drinking water, fuel climate change, destroy the treasures that Americans love. So at some point, Mr. President, the United States Senate ought to draw the line. I think the Giorgiani nomination is such a place. I would urge colleagues to oppose the nomination. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting no, and I yield the floor.